All right, Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Nazarene Way Church is back in action this week. Last week I was out on vacation in Northern California, and this week we're back in action with our sermon. And, before we kick things off, I've hinted at it here and there, and I want to share with you, why the heck am I even doing this? The Nazarene Way Church, what is it? Why am I doing this? Why am I on the Sabbath, which, starts on Friday evenings, okay, why am I conducting sermons when, half of the time I've got a freaking 5-month-old screaming baby in the background? I'm trying to concentrate. I'm trying to, I've just worked an entire week where I run a very profitable and successful knowledge business in which I read, write, think, and create all day, and then come home, and on a Sabbath, right? And starting my own frickin' church and restoring and essentially resurrecting a once dead sect of early Jewish Christianity called the Nazarenes, the original religion of Jesus of Nazareth. Why am I, this crazy guy who lives in Southern California, doing all of this? Well, I'll tell you why. One critical reason in all of this really centers around my son, my 5-month-old son, Fitzgerald Scott Shepard, aka known as Fitzy. And I decided as he was, about to be born, that I wanted to raise him in some type of spiritual faith. And I, myself, I was actually raised early on as an Episcopalian. And it was a fantastic church, fantastic community church. And I really resonated and was brought up to kind of, in the whole going to Sunday school and the beginner's, Bible book, the beginner Bible, with all the pictures and the fun stuff. And I think it really did a fantastic job in helping me ascribe to the archetype of Jesus of Nazareth and love. And that's going to be a message that I talk about here in a moment. However, as I grew older, we started, my family, I guess they wanted me to get into a Catholic school and Catholic high school. And one of the primary ways you do that is by going to the Catholic church. So at some point we switched and we went to a Catholic church. And then after that, I didn't like the Catholic school that I went to. And then I ended up switching to, what I call Hawaiian Christianity, which is I went to an evangelical, Christian, where, the pastor would roll up in a Hawaiian shirt on Sundays. And, you'd hear a sermon that takes a bunch of different Bible quotes, written in the New Living Translation or the New International Version to make it easier to understand and comprehend. Take a bunch of, quotes, combine them together, take them all out of context, and then, the pastor would, go far away at islands. That's kind of the type of Christianity my whole journey. But the one thing I did realize from that is that, very early on, being raised in the Episcopalian church and the stories, and you can even call it the mythologies, some of for the atheists out there. It's really, really odd because I went through a whole phase, where I read a ton, science, Richard Dawkins. I've read everything. Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. I've read just anything and everything I read. And in doing so, I've tried a lot of different things in my life. One phase of my life was I would probably call myself an agnostic at one point in my life. And, I think one of the key principles that I ascribe by, especially in the knowledge business that I run, which is very successful. And by knowledge business, I mean an online business. And one principle that I follow is, quote, the only right answer is test, meaning you need to A/B test your different websites and certain different things. Well, one thing that I A/B tested was living a life in which you believe that in the afterlife there's nothing at all, and you're unsure, you have no proof of God, And, my time listening to Richard Dawkins destroy, religious speakers was just fun and fantastic, watching YouTube videos of that. Listening to people like Sam Harris, the essentially Buddhist mindfulness atheist. That was also interesting, very smart guy, but also kind of a Buzz Killington. In living that life and doing an A/B test of a life wherein you believe that there's probably nothing at all in the afterlife versus a life wherein you believe and have hope that, I think there is something else out there, a higher level entity. What came before the 13.8 billion years ago Big Bang? Well, the Richard Dawkins school of thought and the atheist school of thought would say, nothing. And there's actually a book, I have it. It's called, how something can come from nothing, right? And I ascribe that, potentially we don't know it all. The more we learn about the universe, the more we realize that we don't have all of the answers. What if the scientific, answers that we have currently in the physical world, there's something else out there? What happened before the Big Bang, the 13.8 billion years ago, the explosion? What is it? And I did an A/B test, and I found that, after probably, several years of living as a agnostic, I wouldn't call myself necessarily an atheist. I would just say, it's impossible to know, which technically is true. It's impossible to know, right? And if you live that life versus a life where you have a spiritual grounding, a basis, and also ascribe to live like the character and the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the Nazarene, I'm telling you this much. If you do that A/B test, for whatever reason, every single time, you will have a fuller, richer, happier, more intellectual life if you ascribe to having a spiritual foundation and base to your life. My life got 1,000 times better when I said, you know what? I am going to be open to, studying, religious texts and being open to it and making it a foundation and a part of my life. And as my son was about to be born, I started visiting a lot of churches in this area. And I tried everything. I've tried going to just straight, complete Jewish synagogues, and I actually very much liked it. I also tried, going back to the Catholic Church, and also tried not falling asleep during quote-unquote Mass, which I know is sacrilegious and blasphemy for me to say. But that also didn't do it for me. I found that, which my parents are still a part of. And, there's this whole thing, almost this whole resurgence with Catholicism where it's becoming like cool again and in again. But the problem is I think that if Jesus came back and saw what is being done with Catholicism, he would almost just laugh at all of the doctrinaire, dogmatic, ritualistic things that are the precise things that he was fighting against. Jesus at the time was fighting against the rabbinic resurgence of the school of the oral Torah and law. And, there's like arguments with like the Pharisees and, they're like, how can you do this? It's in the oral law. And Jesus was actually a purist. He said, no, is it in the 5 books of Moses? Is it in the Tanakh? No, screw your oral law, your supposed oral law of all these made up rules, okay, that you are inventing. I'm going to go back to the true source and be a radical purist and see, what did Moses teach? What did Isaiah teach? What did Daniel teach? That's what Jesus, Yeshua of Nazareth, stood for. Okay? And so, anyway, we ventured to the Catholic Church. Then I said, you know what? What would be also fun? Okay, so I tried the Catholic Church. It didn't work out. Okay? Meaning it just wasn't a fit, wasn't for us. And I have read way too much on the historical Jesus in first century, Judea-Palestine history and the true character of Jesus of Nazareth. And then, so I was like, you know what? Maybe we'll go back to the Episcopal Church that I was raised in. However, sadly, unfortunately, that Episcopal Church is, you can call it quote unquote a dying church. There's just like every single person there is over the age of 80 It's a very small congregation. It's almost like the Episcopalian feel has almost a feel of like a slowly dying church that's kind of it forked off essentially from Catholicism, and they even say like, hey, they even have the Catholic creed. It's basically Episcopalian is like Catholics except gays are cool and you can have woman pastors. Okay, that's basically it. And that was innovative and great, I think, early on. But like we went to the church, we tried it out, and it just wasn't a fit. And where we have kind of nestled into is a Messianic Jewish congregation, which is, it's probably the closest to what the actual religion of Jesus was, which he was a Nazarene. And you can watch my very first video. He wasn't Christian, he wasn't Jewish, he was a sect and broke off and branched off from the Hebrew religion, the people of Israel religion at the time. Because the term Jew wasn't invented until very later on. I think in the medieval times, the word Jew was invented. Anyway, in Jesus, essentially, right, he was a Nazarene. And I think the Messianic Jewish congregation gets it closest. However, for some odd reason, and I think it's probably the easiest for them to do, is they still accept Paul, and they still accept all of Paul's teachings, and they do not prioritize the true teachings of Jesus of Nazareth above Paul. They use almost like the Catholic canon, and so there's issues. It's the closest, however, to the Nazarene religion, the original religion in the sect of Jesus of Nazareth. And internally they call themselves people of the way or disciples of the way. And, by the way, I'm speaking all of this. I'm writing also each week and by hand my sermons and things. So I'll probably at some point in the future, I would say over the longer term horizon, be releasing a book backing and sharing all the references with you of everything that I'm spewing out to back them up. This isn't Scott Shepherd just making this up. Every single thing and statement that I make has a backed up reference from a biblical scholar, from actual ancient scripture, from ancient and by ancient I mean like first century, first, second, third, fourth century things. Okay, so I'm not going to bother to like go out and back up every single thing with a reference right now. I'm giving a sermon, but anyway, so that describes kind of the journey I was on. And then I said, Messianic Judaism, it's very, very close, but it is not yet spot on and right in the middle, the center target. And so which I am known to do, if I don't like something, I don't just sit around, complain about it, and check out and say, oh well, this is good enough. I'm gonna go put my interests somewhere else and just play frickin' Fortnite or video games all day or do something like that. No. Instead, I said, it's not perfect. So guess what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do something about it. I'm gonna resurrect, restore, and essentially start and restart the original religion of Jesus of Nazareth and create my own church, Nazarene Way Church. And so, welcome to the ride. We are starting just like the early first century first church of Jesus, right after Jesus died. I'm looking at my son. He's giggling like crazy back there. He's just the best. And the first century church after the death of Jesus of Nazareth was led by his brother James. And it was called the Jerusalem Church. And this was the pinnacle, the foundation, the cornerstone of, the Nazarenes, basically Christianity before Christianity, Jesus' original religion. And their services were actually held. One of the reasons why I'm holding mine in a home is their synagogue services and their church services were held in homes. And you can read about this. So, maybe at some point, yes, we'll get like a facility and we'll grow. But you know what? Home churches are a trend and a massive thing, and it's part of our religion. And really, the cornerstone, the foundation of the Nazarenes started in homes. And so, hopefully, you can appreciate this, humble start. All right. On that note, I want to transition completely with that out of the way and share with you something that I took a deep dive into today. what I have, I write down everything by hand. I think writing things down by hand, I've written out all of my books out by hand. The books that I've written and published, they first started as note cards. And I have a whole rabbit hole that you can dive down called Anti-Net Zettelkost. And it's a book I released that shares this whole system. Anyway, what I spent my time doing today was I looked into the question of why did the Nazarene sect, aka Jesus' actual religion, why did it die off, whereas Gentile Christianity, aka Hellenistic Christianity, Hellenism, by the way, just means Greek influenced, okay? Christianity, why did that thrive, whereas Jesus' actual true religion, the Nazarenes, people of the way, why did that die off? And I went through about 5 books that I have read, and I cross-referenced them and found a list of reasons why the Nazarene movement died. I'm going to share them with you. So the first reason is the Nazarenes died off because of, number one, Catholic persecution. In the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, the Nazarenes and a close cousin of theirs, okay, and it's not quite clear yet on who branched off from who, okay, called the Ebionites, which is Hebrew for the poor ones, okay? Those two groups, which were the lineage and the original groups of Jesus of Nazareth and his descendants and his disciples, the Nazarenes and Ebionites, they were declared by Epiphanius, a 4th century patristic father, shaper of the Catholic Church. They were declared as heretics, okay? And it was heresy, okay? And so that's one reason. And there's many different examples of Catholic persecution of Nazarenes, and that's one reason, okay? The second reason is Jewish persecution, okay? So not only were the Nazarenes attacked by Catholics, okay, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, in which they essentially died off around the 4th and 5th century. So the year like 400 and the 500s, right? They were attacked by Catholics. They were also attacked by Jews. So Jews were in a crisis right after, for the first about like 100 to 200 years after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. The Jews were in wars and constantly fighting with Romans, and they were just enslaved, slaughtered. There was just mass executions and defeats of the Jewish people. So when you're trying to band together and fight and survive, the problem is at the time of Jesus, and we find this in Josephus, the Jewish religion, there was no, and it wasn't even called Jewish religion. They were called the Hebrews or the Israelites. There were 4 different sects, meaning branches, that were kind of fighting, okay? One was the Essenes, which settled and lived around the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea area. One was the Sadducees, and they were the people that controlled the really kind of the power, and they were the high priests. Like Caiaphas was a Sadducee, who was the head of the Jerusalem temple, right? Caiaphas is one of the leading figures that was responsible for persecuting and having Jesus killed, handing him over to Pilate, right? He was called a Sadducee, and there was the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection, right? Then there were, and by the way, when you hear Sadducees, another way of thinking about them, they're really just hired henchmen for Herod at the time. They're really Herodians, okay? They were given a ton of wealth, ton of money. They had a really cushy, nice life, okay? And they were oftentimes at odds with the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees are those that they kind of merged later on, and they had a rebranding, rabbinic, Judaism, and they, essentially the oral law and all of that. And they had a rebranding in the medieval times as what we find today as Orthodox Jews, okay? So those were the Pharisees. And then there was also the 4th philosophy, the 4th school that Josephus talks about, which was the Zealots. And there are some, the Zealots actually came from Galilee. So there's some scholars that try to say, hey, Jesus perhaps was largely influenced, at least his cousins were, or his brother Simon, probably Simon the Zealot, at least one of the disciples. Jesus had a brother named Simon. He also had a cousin named Simeon. And then he also had a disciple named Simon the Zealot. And there's some crossover there. It's hard to like delineate if they are all one person or three different distinct entities. So different scholars disagree and have certain takes on it. And there's a lot of good arguments I've seen on both sides. So anyway, you can actually kind of consider, really, 4 is already a lot to have 4 branches within one religion kind of fighting. So I'm going to list them again: the Essenes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Zealots, all kind of fighting against one another. And then, lo and behold, comes the Nazarene sect. That's 5 sects and branches within Judaism when they're having a crisis of meaning and survival. So what Judaism did at the time, they said there's a lot of Jews, like the Pharisees, became the dominant, the only sect that survived. And what they said is, hey, every one of you, the rest of you, all the other 5, including the Nazarenes, it can be presupposed, are all heretics. And there were vows and certain things where it's like, they would say like, all heretics must burn in hell and die. I don't know the actual verbiage or language. So there was persecution against the Nazarenes, who accepted Jesus as the promised Messiah, the Son of Man, as prophesied and talked about in Daniel, Son of Man. And so, hopefully, I wonder if you can hear Fitzy out there. He's having a good time. So that was the second reason that the Nazarenes died out. The third reason was Roman persecution. So not only were they under attack, the Nazarenes, by the Catholics, by the Jews, by the Hebrews, they were also under persecution and attack by the Romans. As you may know, in 70 CE, there was the first Roman-Jewish war, or Jewish-Roman war. I'm not sure how you, which order it goes in. But there was the Great Jerusalem Siege, the siege of the temple, in which the Jerusalem temple was burnt to the ground in 70 CE. The Romans went to war with the Jews. And then, guess what happened? A little bit later, there was another battle. And then, a little bit later, in 135 CE, there was the Bar Kokhba revolt. He was essentially declared himself the Messiah and attacked and went after the Romans again. And then the Romans came to Jerusalem again in like 135 CE and burned everything to the ground. They almost burnt the entire temple and destroyed it. And I think they were going to call it, they were going to create a massive Greek temple over the Temple of Jerusalem, which infuriated the Jews of the time. And they banned Jews from the entire city. Guess what happened when the Romans did that? When they looked at this whole group of Hebrews, they did not see or understand. It was incomprehensible, way too complex for them to see, oh, no, the Pharisees are bad, but actually the Essenes are good and the Nazarenes are good. No, they lumped every single one of the Jewish sects and people into one category, the Jews. So if they saw a Nazarene and the Nazarene, the follower of Jesus, tried to walk into Jerusalem, they would have him killed. They would persecute him. They would say, get the hell out of here. No, I'm a Nazarene. I'm different than the other Hebrews. They're like, are you circumcised? Yes. Then you're Jewish, and we're going to come after you. We're going to kill you. So the struggling, nascent, early stage Nazarenes were persecuted and killed as well by the Romans. So let's list it off again. Why did the Nazarenes die? Catholic persecution, Roman persecution, Jewish persecution. There was also another issue, and that was with the death of Jesus also was the death of their charismatic leader. The Nazarenes' charismatic leader, and all great movements need a charismatic leader. For the Nazarenes, that was Jesus of Nazareth. When Jesus of Nazareth died, it passed to his youngest brother, which was James the Just. And James, there is no indication that we have that he was a charismatic leader. He was not someone that was fiery. He was completely disciplined. He was stoic. He was called James the Just, James the Righteous. There's even tales of him in Clementine literature where his knees were injured and badly bruised and he could barely walk. He walked with a hunch and a hump because of how long he would sit down to pray at the temple every day. Like his knees were just completely blown out and awful because how much he prayed. And he was the leader of the Jerusalem church, but he was stoic. He was not that fiery, dogmatic, crazy revolutionary, okay, that Jesus was, right? Jesus wasn't really dogmatic, but he was, very passionate. What ended up happening, however, James the Just, right before the destruction of the, Jerusalem in 70 CE, James was killed in 68 CE. So all of a sudden, the Nazarene movement did not have a strong charismatic leader. It then passed down to different relatives of Jesus, like the leadership of the Nazarene movement, and they fled to like Pella, and they fled all over the place. So that was a problem. That's one of the reasons that the Nazarene movement died, is they didn't have a charismatic leader necessarily to lead them that took on. Now, there was a character named Ebion, who is the leader of the Ebionites, which is poor ones. And the guy's name was, I guess, literally Ebion, which means poor, like the poor guy, poor one, right? And he was a charismatic leader, and his sect kind of like took shape and took hold. However, there was this one freaking guy named Shaul of Tarsus, otherwise known as Saul of Tarsus, otherwise known as Paul of Tarsus. And Paul was a Hellenistic Jew, meaning he accommodated, and he was not from, Galilee or Judea or Jerusalem. He was a Roman citizen, and he spoke Greek, and he can kind of play both sides. Well, Paul also just so happened to be a very, very charismatic leader, very passionate. Paul also preached ideas that you've learned about that were completely contradictory to the actual ideas and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, since Paul never even knew Jesus of Nazareth. Paul had a supposed revelation where he saw a white light, just like, frickin' Joseph Smith of Mormonism, saw a revelation and saw a white light. And, he said, hey, I've received a revelation from, a white light named Jesus of Nazareth and Christ Jesus, which actually is an inventation. Christ Jesus, and anytime you hear Christ Jesus, just run, because you're not hearing an actual teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. You're hearing a teaching of Paul. Anyway, Paul was a very charismatic leader, and he was tasked with, essentially, teaching to the Gentiles. And by Gentiles, it really means teaching to the Romans, teaching to those who had power. And so what ended up happening, Paul planted a seed, and that seed grew and grew and grew and grew. And that seed grew and grew and grew and grew with the Romans. Whereas Jesus' seed grew and grew and grew and grew with the Nazarene sect, which was a part of the Jewish sect, which later on was cast out, not allowed to go back into Jerusalem, called enemies, and not even allowed, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and essentially killed off and extinguished. Right? There's like 1.2 billion Catholics and Christians out there in the world, maybe even more, probably closer to 2 billion. Guess how many Jews there are in the world? 12 million right now in this day and age, right? So it's a miracle that Jews haven't even been extinguished in the first place, right? And when you're talking about a small sect and an offshoot of Jews, of the small 12 million Jews that we have today, it's no shock or wonder why the Nazarenes don't exist. So what ended up happening is the charismatic leader, Paul, ended up latching his version of his theology, his Christology, onto the Romans. And guess what? The Romans kicked the living crap out of the people of Jerusalem and the Jews, almost wiping them off the face of the planet. And Paul's religion ended up dominating and surviving and thriving because he latched on to the more powerful political entity. Whereas Jesus's theology, the true core, original theology and Christology of Jesus of Nazareth, latched onto it's essentially itself. which was also, in everyone else's eyes, lumped into just being Jews. And Jews were almost wiped out. And so that's another reason why the Nazarenes died off. Now, what ended up happening is as the Nazarenes were scattered around, Jerusalem, somewhere in Syria, right? Somewhere in the Transjordan, the eastern desert, okay? And they're scattered out all around. When you're scattered around, your number one thing that you're looking to do is survive. And so when the early Nazarenes, for instance, essentially were settled into Syria, they didn't want to just be like, hey, to the outsiders, sorry, we believe in our own thing. They essentially were submerged with and absorbed by the Syrian Gentile Christian church. So that's where some of the Nazarenes went. Another group of the Nazarenes that were in the eastern deserts, they were essentially submerged with a lot of more esoteric and, you can call it very fascinating and interesting ideas and mythologies. One of which is the Elkeseans, which is really interesting. And later on, and then that the Elkeseans may have had an influence on Gnostic teachings, which is a lot of angels, a lot of hidden knowledge and symbology and all of that. So they were just these groups were kind of scattered around, and in order to survive, they were kind of submerged over time with all these other, essentially branches of different forms of belief. So that is essentially really what happened. That's why the Nazarenes died off. Now, I want to share something with you. I've gotten a lot into the intellectual side of the teachings, right? Now, one thing I've realized is that I'm fascinated with the intellectual story of Jesus of Nazareth. And I think one of the biggest problems with the canonical texts, the 27, so-called official books of the Bible, is that there are so many other non-canonical texts that have just as much, if not more, wisdom out there that if we really read into them, we can extract and find the true character and get hints at who Jesus of Nazareth really, really was. And, if you think you can get more out of, who Jesus of Nazareth was by reading about letters of Paul, someone who did not even know Jesus of Nazareth, versus, for instance, some really fascinating early books like the Clementine literature, which Nazarenes and early Jewish Christians, they read and they followed. And even sayings of the Gospel of Thomas, there's just fascinating things in there. Then, if you only ascribe to the canonical Word of God, it does faith a disservice. Okay, but here's the only thing. If you spend way too much time in intellectual land when you're trying to serve your soul in the Spirit, I find that, you need to go back and actually read and take in some of the lessons and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And so one lesson that I want to impart to you today is from Matthew. I believe, let me turn my Bible open to this. Actually, in what I have here, this is actually a really beautiful Bible. It's actually a Catholic Bible by Bishop Robert Barron, who is, he is someone that, he's the first actual Catholic and, or really just I would say Christian that, really spoke to me as an intellectual. Bishop Robert Barron is a fascinating individual. And, he would probably call, it would be interesting for him to hear one of my sermons, because essentially calling the Catholic way and the dogma and, Mass and all of that stuff as essentially something that is not the religion of Jesus of Nazareth, the Nazarene. And I stand by it. It's so freaking obvious and clear if you just open your eyes and read. Now, the problem is, and I'll get on another tangent here, is my mom wants me to talk to her local Catholic priest. But the problem is that when you're so entrenched and when you have 30 plus years of sunk cost of being a priest and being celibate, what's going to happen? Is the priest going to say all of a sudden, oh my gosh, you know what? Hey, heck, you're right. I'm going to become a Nazarene. Maybe, actually. But at the end of the day, I know what I stand for. I know what I believe in. And I believe that, Jesus called himself a rabbi. Guess what I call myself? A rabbi, a teacher, right? Jesus did not walk around lighting incense, reciting some weird doctrinaire thing, telling people to go to confession, believing in the perpetual virginity of Mary. Jesus did not say, hey, you must believe that when my mom had me, Mother Mary, that her hymen was intact. That's weird apocryphal stuff that came in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. I don't know why you would, sorry Catholics, why are you believing in that crap? You should believe in the word and the truth and the actual spirit and the actions of Jesus of Nazareth and the people that actually knew him. James the Just, his brother Jude, aka known as Judas Thomas, not to be confused with Judas Iscariot. And anyway, on that note, I do want to share something with you. And that is, this is from Matthew, which is the most Jewish gospel written out there. And this is from Matthew 5. This is the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. I want to focus on the saying, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. What he's referring to there, what Yeshua of Nazareth is referring to there, is essentially at that time, in that day and age, there was Roman law in which if a soldier is walking with all of his heavy gear, and all of a sudden he sees Jesus and his disciples, or any Jew, any Hebrew, any Israelite, if he sees them, and the soldiers are tired, Roman law says, hey, soldiers, you're allowed to take off your heavy gear, give it to the Jews, and have the Jews walk 1 mile with you as you relieve yourself and walk, and they have to carry your heavy gear. The Jews hated this. They're like, who are these outsiders? These Romans. We are the people of God. Why would our God, if he's so true and so powerful, have the Romans take over our land and then make us walk with their gear that they've used to conquer us 1 mile? Every single one of Jesus' predecessors that I talked about in my last sermon, which were the other messiahs at that time, and some came after him, like Bar Kokhba, and even Judas the Galilean, who was a zealot, right, started the zealot movement. Every single one of them, they declared themselves as messianic figures. But their method, their action, their essentially sword was to say, if a Roman came up to you and said, hey, walk 1 mile holding my gear, the Jews said, screw you, we're attacking you, Romans, and we're going to build our own militia, and we're going to resist you violently. We're going to kill you. What did Jesus say? This is why he is the most influential and important figure to ever live. Jesus said the exact opposite. He said, not only will I take your heavy armor and carry it 1 mile, I want to carry it an extra mile. Why? Because I love you. Every single other false Messiah and failed Messiah said, I hate you. Jesus said, I love you. And I want to do even more for you. Do you see what Jesus did in that specific case? He gave himself the power. He said, you cannot upset me. If any of my enemies, and I want you to think in your mind of an enemy or someone that pisses you off, what if instead of fighting against them, you actually not only gave them what they want, but gave them something on top of that? You have overcome all of that material bullshit and power play that they are fighting over, and you've sent a signal and a message to them that I don't care. You are on the physical level. I am meta. Meta is the Greek word for above. I am at the metaphysical level. I am so far above you. Jesus was not fighting for a physical kingdom on the planet. He was fighting for the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. That was his entire message. Do not fight for or try to defend anything in the physical world, for it is in the metaphysical world, the spiritual world, the kingdom of heaven, that's what you should be fighting for and defending against. So I wanted to share that with you because as I'm getting into the intellectual history mumbo jumbo, the most important thing at the end of the day is for you to dive into those types of lessons and sermons and examples and embody that and integrate that into your own life. That, quite frankly, is what Catholicism has lost sight of. And that, quite frankly, is what we all must never lose sight of. The true character, spirit, and example of Jesus of Nazareth. Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Peace and love. Over and out.